Welcome to the Restore Nigeria News podcast. Tonight, we are discussing the Donald Trump's Tomahawk bombardment of Nigeria as we try to figure out the real motive for the unprecedented action. And if you stay with us to the end, what you're about to hear will help you to connect the dots and tie the strings. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because conversations like this are exactly what you need to hear. Okay, let's begin. When a foreign nation conducts military strikes or carries out any form of unilateral military action in another nation on the excuse or grounds of internal insecurity in the victim nation, it is something of major concern. And this can only happen if the government of the victim nation is weak and has failed in its sovereign and constitutional duty to protect its nation and its citizens. Furthermore, when the excuse for such military intervention is framed that a section of the nation is the victims of internal insecurity, it calls for further scrutiny, concern, and discomfort by serious-minded citizens. The reality is that Nigeria is presently saddled with a pathetic government that has degraded and eroded and thrashed the national pride, international stature, and sovereignty of the country. The current government has absolutely failed to protect both the lives and properties of Nigerian citizens and has shamelessly thrashed the honor, integrity, pride, and sovereignty of the country, so much so that even a dim-witted clown like Donald Trump could go from calling out the country as disgraced to unilaterally ordering bomb strikes on it. This has to be the result of a calamitous failure in leadership. The situation in the country is so bad, and the government, which is out of its depths, is clearly overwhelmed. More than at any other time in our national history, Nigerians, in their significant numbers, have become more disempowered, disenchanted, disillusioned, and more sharply divided along ethnic and religious lines, and that is very ominous and very scary. This is why it came as a great surprise when weeks ago the same hapless and pathetically weak misfit of a president could audaciously launch airstrikes and dispatched his overextended military to intervene in the squelching of a military insurrection in neighboring Benin. A president who cannot competently manage his country's internal security challenges but could brazenly defile the sovereignty of a neighboring state, supposedly to defend democracy. Thus, when karma swiftly struck and Donald Trump fired his tomahawks on Nigeria on Christmas Day, the cries of the violation of Nigeria's sovereignty by some patriots looks rather ironic. Surely what is good for Benin should be good for Nigeria. But the mystery of the strike is that it happened in Sokoto State, not Borno or Yobe states, the epicenter of Boko Haram and ISWAP terror. Not in the lush savannas of southern Kaduna, Benue, or Plateau states, which are predominantly Christian and has suffered tremendous havocs from marauding herdsmen attacks. They didn't strike Niger, a state that is now hotly contested between the elected government and ISIS-groomed insurgents, and they did not strike in the Kogi-Kwara axis from which the insurgency is gradually marching to the south. Suddenly, Trump, who had days earlier enacted an emphatic no entry to Nigerians executive order and imposed a blanket visa ban on Nigerians, including those who are currently getting close to their American citizenship, but who must now face ICE raids, uncertainty, and deportation, decided to intervene to end the genocide on Christians in Nigeria by bombing the country on Christmas Day of all days. Contrast this with how Trump, after falsely accused South Africa of targeted pogrom against white South Africans and ranting and railing against his imagined genocide in South Africa, his solution was the offer of mass immigration, paving the way for hordes of white South Africans to flee genocide by move visa-free to America. But when it comes to desperate Nigerians, he sentenced them to stay at home and die in the hands of their persecutors. What a way to show Christ-like love to these dear Nigerian Christians. Even more curious, just a day before Trump's tomahawk strikes, Benjamin Netanyahu, the maniacal and genocidal prime minister of apartheid Israel, declared his great love for Nigerian Christians, warning of consequences if the persecution of Christians in Nigeria by Islamists did not stop immediately. How do we make any sense of this, when the reality is that the Jews of Netanyahu's apartheid state daily spit on Christians in Israeli streets, physically assault the Christian pilgrims to their so-called Holy Land that is drenched and soaked in the blood of Palestinians they genocide for sport? So, the same Netanyahu, whose security forces were recorded openly attacking Christians worshipping in Israel during this year's Christmas, suddenly remembers his dear persecuted Nigerian Christians and vows to do something to help them. As it is now known around the world, when Netanyahu commands, Trump obeys. The result came swiftly: tomahawk bombing of Sokoto, the seat of the Sultan and spiritual capital of Islam in Nigeria. Curiously, there are minority Christians in the Sudan, and they are heavily persecuted, yet America has shown zero interest in their plight. The Congo Basin is predominantly Christian and is in turmoil, yet America does not make ending the war there a priority. There are many Christian communities in the Sahelian states of West Africa, in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and they are being traumatized by ISIL terrorists, but Trump and Netanyahu have zero love for those ones. Why only Nigerian Christians? So we are left scratching our heads and asking what Trump and Netanyahu are really cooking up. Is it truly concerned about persecuted Christians or some other hidden agenda? If so, what could it be? Let's examine it. What is clear is that the bombing was just theater, a performative theater and a PR stunt. Why so is because despite the 16 or so Tomahawks missiles that were fired, not even one terrorist was reported killed, and from the pictures we're seeing of craters and unexploded ordnances in the desert sands, not a single hut was hit. So why waste the pricey $1.3 million per piece Tomahawks? The answer is rather than fighting Islamist terrorists, the bombing is strategic messaging, a signaling of what is coming. To understand this, look at the map. Sokoto State, the site of the Tomahawk bombing theatrics, is Nigeria's northernmost state and nicely sits at the border with Niger Republic, an AES member state that, despite all persuasions and coercions, threw out a U.S. strategic surveillance drone base. Worse of all, Niger swiftly handed over the same base to the Russian military. This was a slap in the face of the Americans, for which a price has to be paid for Niger's insolence. But now the situation in Nigeria is setting a stage for the U.S. to kill two birds with one stone, to punish Niger for its insolence and to deal with Nigeria, the regional power that arrogantly flexes its puny muscles, daring to intervene in neighboring countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Benin, without Uncle Sam's authorization. As the self-imposed policeman of the world, U.S. hates any so-called regional power making claims to any sphere of influence where it could act on its own whims. That is the right which only the U.S. is entitled to. Because of this, it has always conspired and schemed to cut Nigeria to size. But with sovereigntists like Obasanjo, Abacha, Yar'Adua, and even Jonathan as president, containing Nigeria has not been possible, at least until now, when the much-compromised Bola Tinubu got installed as president. The opportunity to destabilize and possibly fracture Nigeria, a dream of the U.S., has finally emerged. The path to this is by exploiting the widening Christian-Muslim rivalry and animosity in the country to pitch Muslims against Christians and then watch them tear each other apart and start a fire that could burn down and consume the country. That is what all the Christian genocide and the Dear Persecuted Nigerian Christians protestations is all about, to stoke Muslim resentments and to lure Islamist zealots and fanatics in and outside Nigeria to heightened attacks on Christians.
This will lead to reprisal attacks and ultimately a religious war they hope will fracture and break up the country in the way Sudan and Somalia were broken up and destroyed. A look at the map again will explain this two-bird, one-stone strategy by the Americans. The bombed area sits right there at the border of Niger Republic, an AES member state that, despite all persuasions and coercions, threw out a U.S. strategic surveillance drone base. Worst of all, Niger swiftly handed over the same base to the Russian military. This was a slap in the face of the Americans, for which a price has to be paid for Niger's insolence. But now the situation in Nigeria is setting a stage for the U.S. to kill two birds with one stone, to destabilize Nigeria by starting a religious civil war between its Muslims and Christian population, and to hit back at the AES countries.
Now that the bombing Rubicon has been crossed, we should expect to hear about more targeting of terrorists in the border areas of this state, and then by some deliberate accident, in the manner in which stray missiles felled around villages, bombs fired from Nigeria will end up striking villages and formations across the border in Niger. Now imagine when these bombs begin hitting Nigerian military formations across the border. What will happen will be immediate retaliatory cross-border bombardment by Nigerian troops in defense of their territorial integrity. This is how you start inter-country wars. In this case, a Nigeria versus AES war, a dream scenario for US and its NATO ally France. Remember that following Nigeria's bombing of Benin and America's strike on the border state of Sokoto, the AES-aligned state has set up a 5,000-men-strong alliance army, and Niger particularly has called for a nationwide mobilization in readiness to defend its territory from any external or cross-border aggression. This is the US and France's grand plot against Nigeria and the AES, to destabilize Nigeria by starting a religious civil war between its Muslims and Christian population, and to hit back at the AES countries by pitching them against Nigeria in a regional war. If you found today's podcast enlightening and thought-provoking, please subscribe to our channel, share this podcast with friends, and join the conversation in the comments below. This is the Restore Nigeria News Podcast. We speak truth to power, boldly, clearly, and without apology. Until next time, God bless Nigeria.